I always come back to, and please forgive me if I repeat myself, is a description of the narrator being driven by his father to a conversion therapy facility in Tennessee, crossing a bridge over the Mississippi into Memphis, seeing the sun reflecting off a 300-foot tall glass pyramid built in 1991 as a sports arena, which is now a Bass Pro Shop. But for the narrator, it's not a weird Midwestern colossus so much as it is a vision. He described the experience as a pillar of fire piercing his left eye, exploding down his optic nerve, branding his frontal cortex with the pyramid, and leaving a billowing afterimage that floats over the water. This intense ecstasis barely begins to suggest the luminous, transformative, visceral power of Lance's bold and metatextual memoir, Kairos, which interleaves the Catholic Liturgy of the Hours, found texts, illustrations reminiscent of illuminated manuscripts, shifting perspectives, and a richly voiced first-person narrative to give vivid form to the psychedelic strangeness of adolescent sexual awakening, the claustrophobic constriction of institutional captivity, and the mind-bending trauma of being subjected to persistent psychological reprogramming. Kairos is a shattering and astonishing work of self-discovery and aesthetic transformation, aesthetic reconstruction. It is a singular book, and I'm certain it will be a remarkable debut. Indeed, I'm not the only one who thinks so. Lance is here today, of course, as you know, because 2023 Sparks Prize judge Tess Gunty, who happened to also win the National Book Award, selected Kairos for the Sparks Prize last year. Gunty writes, with breathtaking prose, refined pacing, and an undeniable raison d'etre, Kairos sings. Here is a voice determined to excavate interpersonal and institutional hypocrisies with precision and tenderness, generosity, and courage. There is no doubt that the author of this work has embarked on an auspicious literary career. Working with Lance on his thesis has been one of the high points of my time my career as a teacher, and I feel really lucky to have been part of his courageous, complicated, painful, and ultimately hopeful struggle with memory, form, and language. Lance Carroll is a writer who, while born in southern Missouri, has migrated through the entirety of the Midwest. He earned his BA at Shimer College, a great books college in Chicago with a complex and fascinating history. And after a few years on the economy, as they say, he was admitted to the MFA program at Notre Dame in 2021. While here, he served as the co-editor of fiction for Notre Dame Review and taught classes on nonfiction and speculative fiction. He was awarded the Sparks Prize in 2023 and spent the year teaching both at Notre Dame and Wilbur Wright College in Chicago, reading, writing, and working on Kairos. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Lance Carroll.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I also really love that part of that. I'm glad it worked because I talked to someone today who's applied to this program 5 times and hasn't gotten in. And this is my first time, so whatever I was doing must have been working. Today I'm going to read to you from not the beginning of the memoir, as I normally do, because I've read that before for you all. But I do want to tell you about the beginning, because the beginning kind of, if you haven't heard me read before, the beginning sets up sort of the terms on which the book is to be read. Like Roy was mentioning, it does borrow heavily from the Catholic Liturgy of the Hours, sort of this in weird temporal construction. In the manuscript form, it is there are lots of visual and typographic cues that kind of can cue in a reader to this idea, but since we are in a Catholic university, and every time I change the text, I have to reformat it, and I didn't want to do that. When you hear the word, when you hear a reading from the book of, you automatically go to the place I want you to go because of where we are and who we are. You don't need all the typographic things, so I hope that is okay. So, in what may end up as the greatest miscalculation of my life, I attempted to distract my parents from my uneven report card by coming out. Hindsight now reveals the short-sightedness of this gambit, yet in the moment, the payout seemed worth the wager. I think I like boys, I said. Those exact words, with that lifeline of possibility tied around the think. It was a lifeline that I could maybe use to claw my way back to a familial status quo where I was queer only for a specific set of already revealed perturbations of spirit and mind, a kind of queer that was innocent instead of insulting. In the beat after I cast those words into the room, there was a moment where I didn't need the lifeline of the diversion. In that moment, before my words had sunk into my parents' mind and passed through their filters of religion and class and propriety, I was all of me in the open. It felt exciting at first, even a little titillating, and then melted into a profound calm in which I just rested for a moment. But in that moment, there existed nearly infinite ways forward. There existed the possibility of a future where my parents exhaled sighs of relief and small laughs because, of course, they had known for a while now, and how happy they were that I had finally trusted them enough to tell them. There existed the chance of a world in which they just pretend not to have heard what I said and push back behind the smokescreen to the actual topic at hand, grades. And in that world, we never spoke of it again until I was 25 and I graduated from college, and the awkwardness was finally impossible to ignore. There even existed, if only for an instant, the prospect of a situation in which they expressed their initial revulsion and after much soul-searching proceeded into a quiet Cold War until we could go our separate ways and maybe one day find each other again. There existed in that moment all of these potentialities and more besides, some of them more likely than others, some of them more hopeful, almost all of them safe and comfortable. But as is often the case, the possibility that did eventually materialize is one I didn't even know was possible. A reading from the Book of Counselors. A counselor was sought and one was found. A family counselor agreed to see them the very next day. They traveled separately, the father from the bank wearing his suit, the mother from her classroom with her eyes glossy and rusted at the corners, the son from school in his uniform back heavy with books. Welcome, the counselor greeted them. The hardest part is over. You've recognized a problem and sought help. I am here to help you. Tell me, what has brought you here so that I can help you? It is our son, the father said. Something is wrong with our son. He's just confused, the mother said. He just needs some help. Well, I'm here to help, the counselor said. Tell me about his confusion. And they told him their son's confusion, about the way he talked and walked and held his hands, about his clothes and makeup, and about his friends, whose fault it surely was, because it wasn't the friend's fault and it was the fault of the parents. The counselor listened to the confusion. He nodded his head and took notes. When they had finished, he sat back and looked down at his pad of paper. So you think your son is gay? Our son thinks that he is gay, the mother replied. I am gay. I don't think that I am. Why don't I talk to your parents alone for a minute? They talked alone for the rest of the session, alone behind the door. They talked about him. The door opened and they came out. I hope that helps until our next session, the counselor said, and then they left. The next week, they traveled back to the counselor. Again, they traveled alone from the bank, the classroom, and the school. I will see your son alone first, if that is okay, the counselor said. They sat down in the room alone together. Your parents want me to treat you for your homosexuality. Do you understand what that means? They want me to treat you for being gay, but I can't do that. I believe that would be wrong. If you are feeling anxious or depressed, I can help you manage those things. And they worked alone until the end of the session. Then the son switched place with the parents, alone outside while they wait inside for help. A single song finished on the radio and the door opened back up and they gathered their things and they left. They left without saying goodbye and they never saw the counselor again. I learned that mental health professionals use something called the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual to diagnose mental illness. This manual contains lists of criteria for each disorder and a threshold. For example, major depressive disorder lists 9 criteria, things like depressive mood being pretty obvious indicators, but others, like fatigue and decreased concentration, are a little less obvious. A person must have at least 5 of those 9 symptoms in order to pass the diagnostic benchmark for major depressive disorder. Now, most therapists and psychiatrists tell me that this is all more art than science, and the labels can be more helpful than or harmful than helpful. But that wasn't always the attitude towards the psychiatric Bible. The first diagnostic statistical manual, which we can refer to as the DSM, was published in 1952 and included a diagnosis called sexual deviation an umbrella category under which all manner of deviancies, from pedophilia and fetishism to homosexuality and transvesticism, all of which it describes as psychopathic personality with pathologic sexuality. There were no criteria for this diagnosis in the first edition. There was only the label. The DSM-2 expanded the sexual deviation diagnosis to include things like sadism, masochism, and necrophilia. However, in 1973, this edition received an update that pulled homosexuality out of sexual deviancy and gave it the new diagnosis of sexual orientation disturbance. It did this while also addressing the growing sentiment. This is an improvement. You laugh. This is a good story. It did this while also addressing the growing sentiment in the psychiatric community that homosexuality was not a disorder and that pathologizing it was harmful. Quote, this is from the editors, those who argue that homosexuality is a pathological disturbance in sexual development assert that to remove it from the nomenclature would be to give official sanction to this form of deviant sexual development. It would be a cowardly act of succumbing to the pressure of a small but vocal band of activist homosexuals who defensively attempt to prove that they are not sick and would tend to discourage homosexuals from seeking much needed treatment. End quote. In the publication of the DSM-3, sexual orientation disturbance evolved into ego-dystonic homosexuality, which is a Freudian way of describing someone that was heterosexual but didn't experience heterosexual desire. Their ego was not aligned with their sexuality. It is from this definition that conversion therapies draw their justifications. They claim to be correcting the dystonic relationship between a person's ego and their sexuality. Finally, in an update to the DSM-3, homosexuality was entirely removed. The Stonewall riots and other brave actions of many queer people, actions that made them pariahs and put them in extreme danger, directly led to its removal. My mother agreed with the second edition editors and believed that this activism nullified that removal, revealing it to be nothing more than pernicious political correctness, an opinion she formed while earning her master's degree in counseling. I only had my own internal experiences to base my opinion on, but I knew that it didn't feel like something that I could change. Another reading from the Book of Counselors. Another opinion was sought. A second counselor was found. Since the first counselor had allowed his judgment to be influenced by the vagaries of secular culture, the second counselor was a priest. His office was on top of the hill overlooking the college where he taught. This time, the father stayed at the bank while the mother traveled alone from her classroom and the son traveled from the school. They went in and sat down in front of the priest's desk, surrounded by his shelves of books. I hope I can help you today. Shall we start with a prayer, he asked. And the three of them bowed their heads, and the priest asked for God's blessing, for God's wisdom, and for God's courage. They raised their heads, and the priest asked, how can I help you? And the mother told him about the confusion, about the way he talked and walked and held his hands, about his clothes and his makeup, about her concern for his immortal soul, about his friends and how it was their fault. She was a good mother, and if it wasn't theirs, then it would be hers. The priest listened without looking away. When she had finished, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he spoke. I could reach behind me and pull down the catechism and tell you what I'm sure you already know, but instead I'm going to tell you a story about my days in the seminary. Back then, I had a very good friend and one of my classmates. We started at the same time, took all of the same classes, and grew very close. One day, he confided in me that he was gay and that he didn't think he could stay in the seminary. I was surprised and asked him why he wanted to leave. I mean, a vow of celibacy is the same regardless of one's orientation, after all. And he replied that he didn't believe that God would put this inside of him and also make it a sin. And that was not how a loving God would treat his creation. And so he left the seminary and converted to Judaism. I've never been able to decide if he sinned or if he didn't, said the priest. For him, there were 2 points of certainty, that he was gay and that the God he believed in couldn't have made him that way out of malice. There was no way to resolve these things with the teachings of the church, so he left and converted. You will have to decide the answer for yourself, and I can't tell you what that answer will be. However, I am still friends with my old classmate. The mother said nothing. I think I know the answer, the boy said. I think you do too, said the priest. I want to give you this. And he handed the son a postcard. The front bore an icon of a young man, red and sobbing, tied to a fence. The back had a version of Psalm 31, the Passion of Matthew Shepard. God bless you, he said. The mother and the son left as they had come separately. They never saw the priest again. So the church speaks out of both sides of its mouth where homosexuality is concerned. The official doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church is that homosexuality is an innate feature of the person who persistently struggles with it. An omniscient and omnipotent God can't create by accident, so it must be part of the makeup of that person. This comes with a giant caveat out of the other side of that same mouth. Homosexuality is still sinful. It is a disordered form of the sexuality present in natural law. So then what gives? The homosexual person, while having no control over the object of their sexual desire, is instructed to deny that desire completely. They are called to a single life of celibacy, and their homosexuality is their personal cross that God has given them. Not acting on it is their path to holiness, their path to infinite dignity. This seemed deeply unfair to me, but also possible. The God I was raised with had slaughtered all of the firstborn children of Egypt. But there was another God that I knew, the one I met in the spaces between the hours, and this God seemed wholly incapable of something so malicious. Yet another reading from the Book of Counselors. Unbeknownst to the son, a third counselor was sought. The secular worldview had tainted not only the professional counselors, but had infected the church as well. So another counselor was found. They traveled again, the father from the bank, the mother from her classroom, the son from school, but this time they traveled together, for the journey was long. They traveled for hours driving into the city. They arrived at an immense brick church, more stadium than place of worship. This church was not named after a saint or an aspect of Mary. It was called but a single word, praise. They made their way into an office inside of the huge church. They were greeted by a man with a handshake. Please come in and tell me how I can help you today. They sat down, and the mother and the father told him about the way the son walked and talked and held his hands, about his clothes and makeup and his friends, whose fault it must be. The man nodded with each thing the parents listed. I see, he said. I've heard this story before. You have? The parents asked together. I have. I've seen it before, and I've helped other families overcome it. Overcome? Yes, but some of it will be difficult to hear at first. See, it starts in the family. The man spoke for a long time, making reference to diagrams and aphorisms printed on glossy posters hung around the room. He talked excitedly about various options and solutions. Why don't we discuss these options alone for a bit, the man said. The son went out to the car and sat in the back seat listening to music. He played an entire album before the parents returned. They were smiling. In the passenger seat on the journey home, the mother looked through a large stack of forms and brochure of the same logo from the posters was printed on these. She asked the father for a pen and began filling them out and signing. They never saw that counselor again. I don't hear the door open, the one to my room. It is the sound of suction and of brushing carpet fibers that waked me from my sleep the night before my mother's graduation party. A light on the front edge of the vacuum makes the floor into the noon sky while leaving the rest of the room as dark as the night outside. She had deemed earlier that day that the house be rendered immaculate, each surface and object freed from the stain of our family's existence. This need for an absolute state of cleanliness seemed to spring from a deeply felt shame that we used the appliances and furniture, inhabited the beds and bathroom. The house was another child for her, and unlike her less cooperative flesh and blood children, was baptized regularly, made new again with bleach and broom and brute force. For a long time, this had seemed normal to me, that a home was a thing meant to shed its Aristotelian particularities and be perpetually pushed toward the Platonic house. Those first sleepovers at friends' houses destroyed this idea. There were a pile of magazines in a corner that could have been there for days or weeks, and what's more, people read them, which was a sullying avoided by the decorative antique books at my own home. Once finished with her procession around my bed, she checked the stack of paperwork neatly piled on the desk. She quietly and quickly flipped through the pages, finding them still unsigned. She went elsewhere in the house, searching for sin, and I went back to sleep. In the morning, great lists awaited us on the kitchen island, tailored to the ability of their recipients. My little sister was to weed the border of decorative plants that encircled the house. My brother was to help my dad retrieve folding chairs and collapsible banquet tables from the parish center in the basement of the church. I got to mow the yard. This deceptively simple task was complicated by the age and ability of our lawnmower, the slope between the front and the backyards, and the more or less wild portion that abutted the creek. This last was not technically part of our yard, but was being relentlessly tamed into submission at the direction of my mom. Mowing did give me an excuse to listen to music at the maximum volume my little blue iPod could pump out, and this helped make it a little more tolerable. Physical strength has never really been something I possess now or then. This was made apparent when it came time to push the lawnmower up the hill from the backyard or through the uneven and overgrown creek shore. Heat and humidity multiplied the effort required, whether actual or just subjectively, I don't know, but both are abundant where we live. The Mississippi River Valley is basically a trough in the middle of the plains that traps air from the Gulf of Mexico to the south. We called it the air you can wear, and it made me feel like I was pushing the mower through the bottom of a pool. I may also, as my parents insisted, have been lazy, but it wasn't laziness that made my arms shake and my knees buckle after an hour of mowing. To distract myself from my imminent physical collapse, I would let my mind wander into a daydream, probably more accurately called a fantasy, but I didn't know the difference between a harmless reveille, easily broken, and a dissociative escape into the imagination that I could sustain for hours. The difference escaped me because they were equally accessible to me, and I was as likely to slip into one as the other. The hours taught me that it was possible, even necessary, to break with reality at regular intervals, break out of the everyday and escape. This impulse was exercised through near constant reading and trained into a mental athleticism that I could never cultivate physically. My favorite fantasies at the time centered around Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like so many other queer kids of my generation, I unconsciously related to these strange and powerful desires I was feeling as though they were a mystical force, and this force was thought to be evil and dangerous by most, but of course was actually good and helpful when inside a community of like-minded folks. So I most certainly slipped into some sort of powerful daydream as Willow, exacting revenge on her lover's murderers. A daydream that undoubtedly sustained me through not only mowing the yard, but also sweeping bathrooms, sweeping up the garage, dusting anything that stood still, which was then followed by a thorough showering, getting ready and driving to the university, and rendezvousing with grandpas and grandmas, aunts and uncles and cousins of varying remove. It probably also carried me through the ceremony and the pictures of my mom in her cap and gown, with her diploma and newly straightened teeth, carried me back to the house with all our extended family and some friends, to setting up tables and helping people find the bathroom. This daydream, or another like it, must have carried me through all of this, because the next thing I remember after mowing the lawn is sitting across from a distant aunt from Wichita who I barely knew, and struggling to find the words to answer her question. So, what are you going to do with your summer? It was a direct opportunity, I realized, to blow open mine and my family's secret, my sexuality and my parents' newfound plan for it. The thought of telling her pumped adrenaline through my exhausted body and put me on alert. Would she be sympathetic? She might actually agree with my parents' plan of action. She might even already know the answer and be testing my commitment to guarding the familial closet and its attendant skeletons. Yet lying to her felt like the wrong move, too, especially once I realized that my dad had sat down beside me and was listening. I didn't want to demonstrate my ability to lie in front of him, lest he pick up on some sort of tell. The look he gave me said that the literal truth was off limits. A half-truth, then. A clue, even. A clue that a sympathetic aunt might use to uncover this particular skeleton in the closet. Something I don't want to do, I said, after far too long of a pause and as flatly as possible. It is at this moment that the tableau that was my mother's graduation party in the garage is locked in its tightest focus for me. I was testing the borders of my family's secrecy, trying to find a hole through the fence of shame and embarrassment. As soon as those words left my mouth, I saw my mom over my aunt's shoulder, her eyes locked on me, and erected a wall of interlocking fear and anger that I ran into like chain link. Well, no one likes working, my dad said, but we all have to. He's got a job for the summer to save up for college. Whatever else my dad did to twist the truth in such a way that mollified his wife while not strictly breaking his own rigid code of honesty, I didn't hear it. I just watched the opportunity pass out of reach. Now I see myself in that moment, and I want to go back in that garage and climb up on one of those rickety banquet tables and say, look, y'all, I'm gay, and my parents are about to force me into something that I don't want. But in that moment, anything beyond the clue I had uttered was absolutely unthinkable. To publicly disobey them and embarrass them simultaneously, would have provoked extreme consequences. I can imagine my mom grabbing the shovel off the wall of the garage and using it to beat me off my imaginary stage and back into a submissive puddle of flesh and fear, and then yell at me for the mess of blood on the concrete and made to clean it up. In reality, she settled for a surprise backhand after everyone had left that made me see stars for a minute. "How dare you?" she said. "How fucking dare you? This was my day and you just had to try and make it all about you and your disgusting problems." Her accusation hit me as hard as her backhand had. The logic behind it only now seems nonsensical, but back then in the garage, its contorted reasoning found the corresponding keyhole she had long ago installed in my psyche and effortlessly twisted me into a state of shame. A different kind of heat welled up in my face beneath her slap-spitting sting. I was mortified because I felt she was right. She'd been spending all of her time for the last few years going to night classes, dutifully writing papers, recording practice sessions, a seemingly never-ending stream of work. For years, she had said goodnight from her chair in front of the computer and had bags under her eyes in the morning. The cost of her... It is the same. Like, I could tell you what prayer would be said in 2045 on Ash Wednesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Like, there is a timelessness and repetition to it in that way. And in the same way that traumatic memory kind of operates on a kind of person where like certain things will inevitably trigger those traumatic relivings over and over and over again until they let that go. So yeah, repetition I think is absolutely important. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
What's your writing process like over the course of this year? Like, how has it changed since graduating? And like, what? I don't know. I'm a first-year poet, so I don't really write prose, but I'm just curious. Like, do you like come with a scene like when you're writing about your own life, or do you like have it like mapped out and you're just like kind of treading along?
So when I was in the MFA, I did the former, where it was like I would just wherever I was going to be was where I put myself, and I had made the large mistake of writing in the first person present for those periods, and so that ended up being a whole issue for me. And so I learned from that, and post-MFA now, I have a schematic, and so I just go in. Sometimes if it's a particularly difficult passage, I'll write it in the third person first, as though it is happening to someone else, and then come back, and then re-put that in the first person past the reflection and try to incorporate as sort of like a safety or like a, keeping some distance for myself. My process, I have reluctantly found that I have zero willpower when it comes to resisting the internet, none, period. Like, I cannot work upon a computer because I just don't, I can't. My parents installed nanny software when I was young, and I just learned a way around it, and it's just always gonna be who I am. It's going to be to go to the internet. Like, that is just, yeah. So I can't be on a computer. It has to be longhand first, and then I take it into the draft. And I think longhand does really produce a different texture for me of writing, longer, more interesting thoughts sometimes, but it does romanticize it a little bit, and it's harder to like punch out as many words as I think I should. But it's the compromise to getting any words versus, the internet.
Yeah.
Is that kind of?
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up actually?
Certainly.
Like, I'm curious, like, what kind, you were talking about like tense and time. That is interesting. Can you speak more on it?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think for a poet maybe who hasn't thought a lot about that,
Yeah.
possibly, I think that could be really interesting. So the first person present and makes the reader inhabit that viewpoint in that present moment and go along with it through it, which for some of these experiences, to write that made that I was back in that present moment going back through it. And so sometimes it would be, when I would get into that, it would be difficult to leave when I was finished writing. It would continue. And that created difficulties that Roy can tell you about. But it also manipulates the reader in a really unfair way, in a way that can force them to undergo trauma that they may not want to, right? Because you were in that first person, and you were there, and you do not have a choice. Like, I put you there. You can't leave. You can put the book down, but if you want to engage with this narrative, this is where you have to occupy. And so I thought it made it really cinematic and cool and like really whatever. And then the more and more I did it, the more I realized that no, this is bad for me. It's bad for like the night workshop. People are crying. Like, what's going on? Like, no one's winning here. So I said, okay, well, I'll let go of this thing and I can put it into the past. And then the past then gives you access to your present self as the writer. And so you, as the narrator, you can say, this happened, then I feel this way now. Because I also have a lot of really complicated thoughts about sexuality and religion, and in the past they can make it seem like the narrator believes things that are not true. And so having the moment to reflect back lets me clear up some of those issues as well. And it protects me as I write it, and it protects the reader because they can have some distance from it and not be forced to be there in the room like that. Good question.
I wanted to ask about, so, I mean, this was it was great reading. Thank you. You clearly, selected.
I have a flair for the short.
Yeah, well, but what I want to sort of ask about is, I mean, I feel like I can barely remember what happened last Tuesday, but I don't remember. I don't remember the formal elements in your manuscript being as funny as they were in delivery today.
Really?
Yeah, maybe they were, and that's not what I remember. But what I want to ask is, I mean, and so going on from that, so they were very funny, and there was a kind of irony and lightness, and then there was such a masterful shift in tone to where we get that scene at the end where there's the violence and and then the shifting perspectives. It was just really powerful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, but yeah, it works, and it's so well crafted. How, in your process of revising and working on the manuscript, how have you negotiated those kinds of shifts between, and maybe this is too in the weeds to even say anything about, between sort of maybe more moments of, maybe the more formal moments or moments that seem more verging toward caricature, and then these other shifts that are much more intersubjective and kind of painfully open, that, I don't know, because there are these, these different, it goes back and forth in different ways.
Yeah, I think really cool question. I think our culture is allergic to sincerity in a certain sense, and so I think unless you disarm someone with the humor first, they're not open to receiving the sincerity. It comes off as maudlin if it's all in that tone, and that's kind of what I found. And I think the humor has, like the book parts that people found very funny, those have been the same since I submitted to this program, and so I think it's just my delivery, and I think maybe I need to figure out how to get my delivery into the writing a little bit better. That's something I'm taking away from this reading because they are funny. They're caricature. They're meant to be silly.
I'm a bad reader. I read Hunter Thompson and Wayne Burroughs and thought that this is horrible what they're writing. I didn't realize they were funny until I got to it.
Maybe that's it too. I don't know. Maybe I'm just destined to have to read these pieces. I know the audiobook will be great, but the real book will never sell. But I think, that I'm conscious of that shift in tone. What I found is that when writing in that first person point of view, in that first person present moment, I would get stuck and then be in that moment, and in order to leave it, would have to poke fun at something. It's like sort of to deflate the balloon, right? And so that's kind of the origin of some of those things. I think Maggie Nelson has this great bit in the argument where she's saying some really difficult things. She's like, well, what's making this even work at all? And she's like, it's deflation, not dismissal. Like if you can just pull all of the drama and all of the extra stuff out of it and make it funny or do something to it to pull all of that out, then you can still talk about it, even though it's ugly or even though it's weird, or even though it is maybe a little too sincere for modern sensibilities. If you can deflate it, you can leave it. I guess, yeah, Rose.
Thinking back on what Roy had said, I think I had a similar reaction hearing you. Great reading, by the way. I think I had a similar reaction to hearing you read the sections versus what you submitted in workshop, and I could tell there wasn't much of a difference between them. But as I'm hearing you read it, I'm like, these are hilarious. But I remember when I was reading them, I had a whole different reaction with the text. So I'm wondering if, as you're writing, if you're thinking of like the performative aspect of your writing.
You know, there will, because of the way I search, there will always be someone looking over my shoulder, right, and judging whatever it is that I am doing. So yes, in that sense, I am always performing for something. I think, but in the way that a poet thinks about the performance of a voice and the way that comes up, I don't know that I always think that way. I think I like the way sometimes words sound, or that they go together, or the way an effect happens, and I just kind of go with that. But as far as performing a certain kind, like if I'm performing a funny voice, this is a serious voice. I think what I'm like taking away from this reading, honestly, is that maybe there is something missing between the way I'm talking these, or when I'm speaking these things, and the way they need to be written, and maybe there just needs to be a revision, or I don't know.
Yeah. Two questions actually. The first thing, I really liked the kind of trio of these different characters that, you know, the narrator is talking about with your, what do you call it, the counselors?
Yeah.
Was that a deliberate choice? Was this an actual, like, the actual sequence of events?
It
Or
was.
it was, and it just happened to fall into a trio?
Yes.
Because that has a very, very biblical feel. Like
It does.
Repetition, like, that I felt it was just masterfully done. So I guess that's not a question. Here's a real question. With the mowing scene, which I thought was very interesting, when you're accessing these memories, and then choosing which things to include, it flows so seamlessly, and yet I can't imagine, and obviously this was a very pivotal event, but for me, looking back on my memories, I very rarely have sort of a, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. So how do you access those memories, and at what point do you as the writer decide, I'm going to insert this here as the most probable thing that I was thinking about? You know, how does that work?
Fabulous question, honestly. Yeah. So the key word here is perhaps, right? Perhaps this was the fantasy I had while I was mowing. Maybe it was another one. I know that I had fantasized about those things when I mowed. I know that I did mow that day. It is reasonable to assume that those were the same, and if they're not, like, if it was about Star Trek and not Buffy, like, what difference does it make in the end? I guess. I think perhaps is the key word here. Like, if we can get is it plausible that this is the thing that happened? You know, I'm certain that a series of events took place that we had to get our house ready on that date. Was it exactly those 5 or 7 things that I list? I don't know for sure. It was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. How old am I? It was 20 years ago. So memory is fallible, right? And I don't want to mislead anyone into thinking like, no, this is exactly what happened. So I avoid. I'm not saying, I woke up at 7 a.m., I put gas in the mower, I went down, it was raining, it was 72 degrees and 100% humidity. Like, we try to, I can give it a sense without using super exact language. And then I try to keep that perhapsing moment going as long as possible until I can really arrive at something that I know for sure happened, and I can really triangulate what was going on. So that happens when my aunt asked me this question, and I can still see it if I were like in this room right now. Like, it just freezes, like, I know where everyone was, what was going on, because it's cemented that way. And so I try to use those moments as those anchors, and then we'll get a really dense piece there, and then we can go back to perhaps into another moment, as long as the truth of it is mostly there. The biblical thing that you brought up first, though, is wild, is it not? Like, it is, and it's wild to me, the progression we took. Like, my mother was earning her degree in counseling, so of course we see this one person, never see them again, we see a priest, doesn't get the right answer, now it's a devout Catholic family, is going to an evangelical church in St. Louis for answers, what is happening, where are we going? And then the whole second chapter is the book of Exodus, but it's rewritten because there is a pyramid in Memphis, and you can literally write it like the book of Exodus, but in Memphis, but in Tennessee. It's wild. So yeah, I definitely capitalized on those moments because of the content and the way they overlap. So some are fortuitous, some are, architected a little bit, but